I want you to close your eyes and imagine the thing you want most in the world. The one thing, just one thing. Not the thing that it would be great to have like a private jet, but the thing that you really want to accomplish in your life. Now imagine that you accomplish everything else except for that. That one thing you still lack, but you got everything else. Every other goal you want to achieve in life, you have. Could you just walk away from your dream? Could you collect your winnings and go home? That was the question that Hitler faced in 1939. He had restored Germany's honor and her defenses. He had united his home country of Austria with Germany without firing a shot, and conquered Czechoslovakia with ease, and in so doing greatly expanded German territory. He had stabilized the German economy, centralized the German government, all in the course of a few short years. He was poised to go down in history as another Bismarck, one of the great German statesmen of all time. But he had not accomplished his most audacious stated goals of making Germany an independent global power on par with the United States, Russia, and England, or of freeing Europe from international Jewry. He had not smashed Bolshevism. And so he risked everything that he had accomplished on one more gamble. And then he did it again, and again, and again, and again, until he lost everything. He would kill himself just 5.5 years later. His armies defeated on every side, everything he had built reduced to nothing. And so on part 3, we will be discussing how Adolf Hitler built the greatest European empire since Napoleon and lost it all in a few short years.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
This was our tiny tower.
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to take this chance to apologize to absolutely nobody.
Hello, and welcome to How to Take Over the World. This is Ben Wilson. This is part 3 on the life of Adolf Hitler. It is going to take us from the Reichstag Fire until the end of Hitler's life. I do need to give you one warning, which is that we are going to go through this rather quickly compared to previous episodes. Why is that? Well, there's a good quote that I like from Peter Thiel. He says, "I think failure is massively overrated. I think people actually do not learn very much from failure. Most businesses fail for more than one reason. So when a business fails, you often don't learn anything at all because the failure was overdetermined. You will think it failed for reason 1, but it failed for reasons 1 through 5. And so the next business you start will fail for reason 2, and then for 3, and so on." And I do think that's true to a certain extent. Why did Hitler fail in World War II? There are so many reasons that it's actually difficult to disentangle them all. In Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy begins with the sentence, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." In other words, you actually can't learn that much from an unhappy family because there are innumerable ways to fail. People often ask me, why don't spend more time on the foibles and weaknesses of these great leaders that we learn about on how to take over the world? And that is why there's just isn't that much to learn from failure, I think. It's much better to focus on the successes. I actually don't agree with Tolstoy that all happy families are alike. What I would say is that there are only like 5 or 6 kinds of happy families, right? There are families that play, families that banter, families that do meaningful work together. So they're slightly different, but there's only a few ways to be a happy, successful family. Similarly, in the realm of successful leadership, I would say that all leaders are alike, but not exactly alike. And there are a few different archetypes. And to find those archetypes, it's much more important to focus on their strengths than their weaknesses. So all that was a long-winded way of saying, I'm going to tell you how Hitler failed during World War II, how his leadership ended in great crimes, but I'm not going to go into as much depth and detail as I did in the first 2 episodes. Additionally, World War II is a very large, complex war. It really was a world war. It was global. And so we're barely going to touch on the Asian theater, and even within the context of the European theater, there are just a lot of parts of it that we aren't going to be able to touch on in that much depth. There are a lot of great World War II podcasts, and this isn't one of them. This is about the life, leadership, and decision-making of Adolf Hitler. Okay, I think that's enough table setting. Let's get into it. This is part 3 on the life of Adolf Hitler. This episode is brought to you by Helix Sleep. I've got a lot of problems in life, but one of those problems is not a good night's sleep. because I sleep on a Helix mattress. Helix is amazing, seamless delivery, shows up right at your doorstep. You just open the package, it unfolds, and it's ready to go. I used to have really bad back pain when I woke up, and I don't have that anymore since I started sleeping on a Helix mattress. I absolutely love Helix. I think you will too. They create some of the best mattresses out there. They've received numerous awards from the industry, and 82% of people who have tried them have found that they got more deep sleep from sleeping on a Helix mattress. So check it out at helixsleep.com/takeoverpod to get a 25% discount. Again, that is helixsleep.com/takeoverpod, and make sure to use our name at checkout so they know we sent you. This episode is brought to you by Incogni. Try Incogni. It costs almost nothing, and you're going to love it. You know why you're going to love it? Because it feels good. Incogni is a service that helps remove your private data from the public internet. I use it and I love it because it's got a little graph of every single time that my data gets removed from some data broker somewhere where I don't want it appearing. And it's just so fun to see me not have to do anything and them take care of it so that I've got a smaller and more manageable footprint online that I can control. Take control of your privacy, take control of your life. It's good for protecting you from scams and spam and all these other things. It doesn't cost much. If you use my promo code, you're gonna get 60% off. So just try it. Go to incogni.com/takeover. Cancel after a month if you don't think you like it, but I really do. I really enjoy using it. Again, that is incogni.com/takeover. Use code takeover for 60% off. So on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag burns. A Dutch communist is found inside. Hitler has been chancellor for less than a month. The next day, Hindenburg signs an emergency decree. It is called For the Protection of People and State. It suspends civil liberties indefinitely. And Hitler now has a license to do almost anything, and he uses it. This is the pattern that you need to understand for the early years of Hitler's reign. He uses each grant of power to acquire more power. Every emergency becomes an excuse for more authority. Every victory becomes the foundation for the next one. He's never satisfied with the amount of power he has. He's always saying to himself, okay, how can I use this as a platform to get more power? There's an election held on March 5th, 1933, and the National Socialist Party gets 44%. With their conservative partners, they have a narrow majority, and that's enough for what he wants to do. You sometimes see this narrative that the Reichstag Fire sweeps Hitler into power with popular acclaim, and from there on out, he's got no opposition. He can do whatever he wants. But that's not quite right. You know, right after the Reichstag Fire, there is an election, and they get 44%. They get less than a majority. Now, it is the greatest vote share that they have received yet, but there's still quite a bit of public opposition and skepticism of Hitler and his party at this point. Between March 5th and March 9th, nearly all non-Nazi state governments are brought under Reich control, Bavaria first, then everywhere else. On March 22nd, Dachau opens as the first concentration camp. Hitler ties this opening of this camp to the Reichstag Fire, and at this point, it is primarily for communists, far-left activists, and other political opponents, not the widespread detention of racial minorities. On March 23rd, the Enabling Act passes, and once again, there's enough opposition to make this not quite a sure thing that the Reichstag is going to pass it. But the SA and the SS, these are the armed paramilitary forces of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, they surround the Reichstag, and so using physical force, they intimidate opponents and make sure that this Enabling Act passes. Hitler secures the act through tactical promises to the center-right about preserving institutions and church rights. If you recall, there's the Zentrum Party, the centrist party, and it's primarily Catholic. And so he makes all these promises to the Catholic Church that, hey, pass this Enabling Act and we'll protect your rights. We'll play nice with you. Of course, in time, Hitler will break every one of these promises, but at this point in time, he still doesn't have his reputation for deceitfulness that he will later acquire. Officials begin acting by what historians call the principle of working towards the Führer, and it was called that at the time. What this means is Hitler actually issues remarkably few explicit orders. And all these other institutions, like the SA, the SS, the Gestapo, the military, they all act on their own initiative to accomplish what Hitler has set up as the goal of the administration. And so subordinates compete to anticipate what he wants and carry it out. They radicalize without being told to because they're competing with other power sources. And so they escalate without being asked. This is the leadership style that builds the Third Reich. Essentially, you have Hitler making speeches and holding meetings with senior party and government officials to set the direction, but remarkably few explicit orders are given in terms of how to carry out those wishes. So what this leads to, again, is a lot of one-upsmanship, right? The SS saying, okay, the SA is doing this, we better take it a step further. And so what this leads to is a lot of extremism as people compete with each other to be even more National Socialist, even more right-wing, even more in touch with Hitler's wishes. The classic example of this is anti-Semitism, where actually there are no anti-Semitic laws passed under Hitler for the first few years of his regime. So everything is going great for the Jews in Germany, right? Like no anti-Semitic laws for a few years. Well, no, actually, while the Jews are not yet suffering the persecution of later years, what is happening is that the SA, the SS, the local police, the state governments, the Gestapo, the military, all these small factions are all competing to show Hitler that they are doing the best job of carrying out his wishes by smashing up Jewish-owned shops, harassing Jews on the street, burning synagogues, all that kind of thing. Now, of course, we have to separate this style of leadership from the ends that Hitler has in mind, right? We have to ask ourselves, could you use this style of leadership in a positive direction? Like, let's separate it from what they're trying to accomplish. Is this a good way of managing things? And there's something to be said for it, and then there are some obvious negatives that come with it. There is actually something to be said in that it leads to a certain amount of initiative on the part of your inferiors, right? People are not waiting for explicit directions. Things are happening. It gets people going and moving. But of course, it's also chaotic, right? No one knows exactly where orders are supposed to come from. People have overlapping lines of authority. And what is this particularly ill-suited for? War, right? In war, you want very clear lines of authority. You want to know exactly who to look to for orders. And that is something we will see later in this episode. This leadership style builds the Third Reich, as I said, but it also destroys it as World War II eventually envelops the continent. So in October of 1933, Hitler withdraws from the League of Nations. This was quite popular at the time. Remember, the League of Nations is kind of the forerunner to the United Nations, and it's created by the same people who had forced the Treaty of Versailles on Germany. The League of Nations is seen as the legitimating mask of Germany's humiliation. So this is the most popular move of Hitler's early chancellorship. And it does a lot to build his popularity in Germany. I think this is what people fail to understand about Hitler and his rise in Germany. Yes, he stabilized the economy, which we will talk about, but it was really the reversal of Germany's national humiliation that made him so popular. But at this point, he's not a wildly popular leader, but it is a move that helps to build his base of support. This episode is brought to you by my startup, the Classical Society. The Classical Society is a business network that was started by me and my friend Alex Petkus, who's the host of the Cost of Glory podcast. And the idea is, if you're going to join a professional network, if you're going to join something like a YPO or a Vistage, where you're working with other people, you're engaging with them, you're seeing how you can help each other out, why not join a network where you align with people who have the same values as you? So if you're a person who believes in the values of how to take over the world, who believes in classical values, who believes in excellence over equality, who believes in virtue, who believes in striving and trying to be the most that you can be, then consider joining the Classical Society. You can learn more and submit an inquiry at theclassicalsociety.com. I hope you'll check it out. By the autumn of 1933, Hitler's dictatorship is effectively consolidated. There is no effective political opposition, none. The left has mostly been legally dismantled, and the right has been co-opted into working with Hitler. And I say legally dismantled, And that is because there are extrajudicial persecutions, the SA, the SS, raiding communist headquarters, beating people up, stuff like that. But actually, most of the work is done through the normal courts because this is the government now. And so through those technically legal mechanisms, Hitler is able to dismantle communist parties, leftist parties, a lot of labor unions, a lot of sources of potential opposition to his administration. And yet, despite this rapid consolidation, Hitler does still have potential sources of rival power, not outside the regime, but within it. The two centers of independent power that remain are the regular German army, which still answers ultimately to President Hindenburg, and the SA, the brown shirts, the stormtroopers. There are 4.5 million of them, and they are led by Ernst Röhm. Röhm is publicly loyal to Hitler, but privately, he's often very dismissive of him. He wants, that is Röhm, wants the SA to absorb the regular German army. He says, look, the German army is still struggling to rearm. We've got all of these men who are fighting men who are willing to help us out. And so, he thinks the revolution has not gone far enough, and ultimately the military should be answerable to him and the SA. There's an SA officer, Lutze, who records what Röhm supposedly said about Hitler in early 1934. So Röhm supposedly says, quote, "What the ridiculous corporal declared doesn't apply to us. Hitler has no loyalty and has at least to be sent on leave. If not, then we'll manage the thing without Hitler." All right. This may or may not be true, but it is certainly true that Röhm often said things that were dismissive or even disparaging about Hitler. He's a very proud man, Röhm, and he still believes that what he has accomplished with the SA is more important and more impressive than what Hitler has done politically. Now, I should say that while Röhm really was openly disrespectful of Hitler, there's definitely something else at work here, which is that some of his opponents in the German Workers' National Socialist Party are jealous of his power and influence and want to see him gone. In particular, Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler within the Nazi Party and elements of the military as well. Himmler has documents fabricated that Röhm was accepting bribes from France to overthrow Hitler. And so they put together this whole fake conspiracy and they show it to Hitler. Now, the SA has millions of members, as we just discussed. In sheer manpower, it overwhelms the German military. Again, this coup is a fabrication, but Hitler has to take it seriously because a coup by the SA would be very difficult to suppress, perhaps impossible. And so, in an environment where he's not sure if this is real or not, he's got to take action. And so on the night of June 30th, 1934, Hitler has Röhm and dozens of other SA leaders murdered. Other old enemies are killed too, settling scores from years before, including Kahr, who you might remember from the Beer Hall Putsch, Gregor Strasser, one of the founders of the left-wing branch of the Nazi Party, and Kurt von Schleicher, who preceded Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler actually orders that Röhm be given an honorable way out of his long years of service, so he's taken to a prison cell, and Röhm is given a pistol with a single bullet, and basically told, you know what to do. And Röhm throws it aside and yells at the guards, "If I am to be killed, let Adolf do it himself." And the guards go, well, that's not going to happen, and so they shoot him to death. Conveniently for Hitler, when the senior leadership of the SA are arrested and assassinated, they are frequently caught in the middle of homosexual orgies. So Ernst Röhm was a well-known homosexual. Hitler didn't really like that kind of thing. He wasn't like, supposedly he's a bohemian, but he's not really down with homosexuality. But he also wasn't too opposed to it. He knew this about Röhm, and he didn't disclose it. He didn't humiliate him. He was willing to kind of paper over it as long as Röhm was discreet about it. Röhm's was considered to be a sort of manly homosexuality. I'm sure comparisons were made with the Hellenistic Greeks. The important thing was basically that this was an aggressive, active homosexuality, not passive. This is a family show, so I won't elaborate too much on what that could mean. You can imagine them saying something like, look, you can sleep with other men, just don't be gay about it. All right, that was kind of like the attitude. So, they knew that this was happening. I don't think, though, it was widely known how much a culture of homosexuality had spread in the upper ranks of the SA. Again, this is an organization with millions of members. The vast majority of the SA, this is not something they're participating in. But at the highest levels, Rome and his direct subordinates, it's like quite common for them to have these drug-fueled orgies and widespread homosexuality. Okay, so yes, when SS and Gestapo men come to arrest and kill them, they often find these senior SA leaders naked in rooms with lots of other men. And I'm sure this is exaggerated by Goering and Himmler for even more propagandistic effect. The upshot is this very violent purge is actually pretty popular with Germany. As I said, many of these organizations were kind of competing with each other to be the most extreme, and the SA had probably been the most thuggish of any of them. People were actually pretty sick of them causing violence and acting like goons. And then word is leaking out that they were plotting a coup with France, with foreigners, and that the troops that were sent to retrieve them found them in all these drug-fueled homosexual orgies. So the attitude of people when they hear about all this, and at this point, the Nazis basically control the national press. So people hear this and they think, all right, thank you, Hitler, for saving us from these demonic gangsters. That was the feeling of a lot of the people in Germany. So with the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler boosts his popularity and consolidates his power within the movement and takes out his last opposition within the National Socialist movement. And then Hindenburg dies a month later. And Hitler immediately combines the office of Chancellor and President, and he becomes Führer, which simply means leader. And so now the military answers directly to him. So within the space of a couple months, he has eliminated those two sources of potential internal opposition. From this point on, every soldier swears an oath of loyalty, not to the nation of Germany, but personally to Adolf Hitler. So with his domestic position absolute, Hitler now turns outward. The first 3 years of his chancellorship had basically been spent consolidating power at home. Okay, so we've kind of gone through that. There's economic reforms. He brings in this economic genius, this guy named Schacht, to kind of get things on level footing. He orients the entire economy towards rearmament, getting the military back on its feet, more weapons, more arms, more soldiers. And now he begins to dismantle the post-war order that had been imposed on Germany at the Treaty of Versailles. And here we come to the critical theme of Hitler's early reign. When boldness was called for, his decision-making was genuinely excellent. So on January 13th, 1935, the Saar territory, which is a small region on the border between France and Germany that had been transferred to the French after World War I, votes on where they would like to end up. And almost 91% vote to rejoin Germany. So this is a bloodless triumph for Hitler. It's a sign of public approval. He then turns his eyes to the Rhineland. The Rhineland, again, is this region of Germany in the west, bordering with France, that's very, very important. It's economically very prosperous. It's a very wealthy land. And the Treaty of Versailles had demilitarized it. It said, Germany, this is still your land, but you can't have any forces in it. You can't have any military forces, which basically leaves it completely vulnerable to forces from France or from other powers. The Locarno Pact of 1925 reaffirmed the situation. And Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, and Germany all signed Locarno. Of course, this is before Hitler comes to power. Humiliatingly, the French had, since World War I, occupied the Rhineland. So it was still German territory, but it didn't feel fully German and it didn't feel secure. And for the people who lived there, it was a very precarious feeling. They didn't feel secure or defended at all. And that feeling expands beyond the Rhineland itself, because Germans feel like, man, we don't even control all of the territory in our own country. This is one of the things that causes Germans to feel so humiliated. So in the spring of 1936, Hitler decides to reoccupy the Rhineland with German troops. Hitler's advisors are very nervous and actually argue against it. This is technically a breach of the Treaty of Versailles, and the German army, while rapidly rearming, is still very weak. France and Britain could roll right in if they really want to. And so some of his men fear international escalation, especially given the ongoing economic crisis. But Hitler reads the room better than anyone else. He sees that the British are exhausted from the First World War, and he sees that the French are waiting to see what the British will do. And so he thinks, if we just act boldly and assert our authority, no one's going to do anything. So on March 1st, 1936, in beautiful Munich spring weather, Hitler decides that they're going to do it. And on March 7th, 1936, German troops cross the Rhine. Only 3,000 troops go into the demilitarized zone, and they have orders to retreat at the slightest sign of French opposition. So this isn't like some bold invasion. This is just a gamble. This is a bluff to see if the French are going to do anything. But there's no opposition. Stanley Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, says of intervention, quote, "They might succeed in smashing Germany with the aid of Russia," speaking of France, "but it would probably only result in Germany going Bolshevik." Okay? So many other countries are worried about Germany turning communist. So Britain is saying it's not even necessarily in our national interest for us or France to really, hold to the Treaty of Versailles and kick the Germans out. The editor of the Times of London writes, quote, "It's none of our business, is it? It's their own back garden that they're walking into." All right. And that was the opinion of much of Europe. Look, technically, yes, it is a breach of the Treaty of Versailles. They're not supposed to be rearming. They're not supposed to occupy the Rhineland. They're doing it. But at the end of the day, it's Germany. It's Germany sending troops into Germany. So Hitler does walk into his own back garden. The League of Nations condemns it, but the condemnation is irrelevant. Locarno is dead. Versailles is mortally wounded. The rest of Europe is wary, but not panicked. And the German people are ecstatic, over the moon. For 2 decades now, it has been nothing but misery and humiliation for Germany. I mean, think about what they have gone through since, 1916. Defeat in World War I, and it's this kind of perplexing, humiliating defeat where they are actually never pushed back into German territory, but there's this treaty that, and they end up losing. Okay, so defeat in World War I, then helplessness as Versailles is foisted upon them, and it seems like everyone is against them. Versailles is like maximally humiliating. It blames the Germans for all of World War I, which is probably unfair. And then they have the terror of the Soviet republics that are formed in German territory. It seems like all of Germany might go communist for a time. Then there's the chaos of countless governments rising and falling. And then there's the poverty, hunger, degradation, the Great Depression. Okay? It's been nothing but chaos for 2 decades. You've gone through all of this. And now you have someone who seems to have this all ironed out. The economy is doing fine, is doing well, seems to be going okay. Things are no longer in free fall. And for the first time since the Great War, things are no longer going backward. They're going forward. We're recovering territory, winding back the clock on some of the worst elements of this new world order. And so this reoccupation of the Rhineland does a lot to ingratiate people to the National Socialist regime. Hitler's approval rating shoots to nearly 90% almost overnight. Listen to what one woman had to say. Her name is Louise Solmitz. She's a German woman whose own husband had just been declared a non-citizen under the Nuremberg laws. I said for the first few years they don't pass any anti-Jewish laws. Well, they finally do a few years later in late 35 or early 36. Okay, so her own husband has just been declared a non-citizen, and they're facing the persecution of Jews within Germany. All right, so she's got all sorts of reasons to be opposed to Hitler. But even she writes in her diary, quote, "I was totally overwhelmed by the events of this hour, overjoyed at the entry march of our soldiers, at the greatness of Hitler and the power of his speech, the force of this man." All right, so even for people, leftists, people who are either Jewish or attached to the Jewish community, who like had been vociferously opposed to Hitler. It's such a powerful moment of national pride that even these people are persuaded oftentimes and find themselves swept up in the moment and find themselves supporting Hitler. And from this point on, Hitler is more than ever a believer in his own infallibility. Few national leaders ever get to experience this type of moment that really unifies the country when everyone is saying, wow, you're one of the greatest national leaders that Germany has ever had. That is how people feel in this moment. And so from this point on, Hitler starts to talk more in sort of pseudo-religious symbolism. This sort of messianic rhetoric starts to infuse his speech. He starts to see himself as more than a politician. He probably always had seen himself as more than a politician, as a leader of a movement. He always had seen himself in sort of messianic terms, but now it really comes to dominate his thinking. And that self-belief will serve him well, actually, for the next 4 years, and then it will destroy him. So it is interesting. There's that quote from Steve Jobs that I really like, where someone asks him what his weaknesses are, and he says, I don't know. Strengths and weaknesses are usually flip sides of the same coin. And that's true of Hitler. Like, this self-belief, this unbelievable self-belief, leads him to do remarkable things and accomplish things that no national leader had done since Napoleon. But it also leads him to gamble everything over and over again until he loses it. But before the gambling escalates, Hitler has one more great propagandistic performance to give. Just 5 months after troops marched into the Rhineland, the world comes to Berlin for the 1936 Olympics. And here's the thing about Hitler. I said in episode 1 that his one unique gift is his ability to speak. And that's true. But his second unique gift that set him apart from everyone else was for propaganda. And the 1936 Olympics is the masterpiece, the Mona Lisa of his propaganda efforts. Joseph Goebbels, directs the operation. The Nazi administration spends 42 million Reichsmarks building a 325-acre Olympic complex. And this is, the 1936 Olympics really are the first modern Olympics. It's kind of a new movement, only started a few years before. And really, to be honest, the 1936 Olympics is much more similar to the Olympics of the 21st century than it is to what had come before. The centerpiece is a 110,000-seat stadium, all made of natural stone. It is the largest stadium in the world. And it's beautiful. It's amazing. There are other beautiful, amazing venues. It's all very well architected, very well engineered. Despite all this, of course, there are calls for boycotts. American journalists report on Nazi persecution of Jews, churches, opposition parties, labor unions. Like, people know all this stuff. And the head of the American Olympic Committee considers a boycott. So the Nazis invite him to Germany. And they show him special training facilities, supposedly for Jewish athletes. They give him the VIP treatment. They try really hard to assuage his concerns. They say, look, we're not these anti-Semitic thugs that everyone makes us out to be. We're actually pretty normal people. And he returns to America convinced that the Olympics are for athletes, not for politicians, and that all these supposed crimes in Germany are maybe a little bit overblown. And so on December 8th, 1935, the boycott proposal is voted down by a razor-thin margin. The Americans will participate in the Olympics. Hitler's administration quickly puts a very good face on the city of Berlin. Any signs that read "Jews not welcome" are removed from public spaces, restaurants, hotels, you name it. So any smashed up Jewish shops are quickly either rebuilt or papered over. Brown shirts and SS men, normally gruff, and as I said, they can be bullies, they can be goons. They are ordered by the German Workers' National Socialist Party to be overly friendly to international tourists. They say, hey, no shenanigans while the Olympics are going on. And to Berliners, this can seem amusing. Like, these guys who were goons just 6 months ago are now smiling, friendly, shaking your hand. How can I help you? Where do you need to go? But it works, for people coming from outside of Germany, they don't know any different. And these people seem very friendly. They also, they clean up the city. Any undesirables, homeless people are sent to detention camps outside the city. And then the games begin. 51 nations, over 5,000 athletes. The Hindenburg airship flies low over the stadium. It looks very cool, very modern. 3,000 Germans sing the national anthem. They put on great opening games that are very impressive, and they treat foreign athletes very well. Jesse Owens, an African American, wins the 100 and 200 meter sprints, and rather than being met with what many people expected, which is, stern Hunnish barbarism, German fans chant his name. They surround him for autographs in the streets. These seem like normal, well-adjusted Europeans. And Owens later says, and he says to the press, that he didn't feel snubbed by Hitler. According to Owens, at one point during the track and field competition, he glanced up at Hitler in his box seat, and the Führer stood up and waved at him, and he waved back at Hitler. All right, so as a piece of propaganda, the overall effect that Hitler is going for is Hitler is insurgent. We're growing, we're doing better, we can organize, we can create beautiful things. And also, we're normal. Okay? Everything that you've been reading about us bullying Jews and suppressing opposition parties and murdering people in the Night of the Long Knives, that's all overblown. This is a normal place, and we're doing well. Germany wins 89 medals. The Americans got 56. Leni Riefenstahl films the whole thing and is able to create incredible, she's this remarkable filmmaker in Germany, and she creates remarkable propaganda from it. And so the Nazis succeeded in getting what they wanted from hosting the Olympics. Respectability. Hundreds of international journalists acknowledge that Germany has put on the most lavish Olympics ever. Tourists leave with happy memories. The world sees Hitler as a normal statesman. Right wing? Sure. But in the mainstream. So the 1936 Olympics really go off without a hitch. Now, unknown to most of the external world, Hitler has a problem, which is that he has oriented the entire economy toward rearmament. So industrialization is picking up, all these factories are being built, people are getting back to work. However, it's not like normal industrialization where all of this then creates an inflush of cash that you can sell your products on the international market. No, it's all going towards rearmament. No one else is buying it, right? So you're just spending money without anything else coming back in return. And so Germany is broke and near its limit in terms of its borrowing power. So financially, Germany is on the brink. They desperately need an infusion of cash. And so people often ask, okay, things are going well. Germany is popular. Why does he so quickly start turning toward expansion after the 1936 Olympics? And there are many reasons. Part of it is psychological. Hitler is a gambler, always wants to be aggressive, always wants to be on the move. Part of it is financial as well. He needs to use this military machine or else progress is going to stop and they're going to run out of money. And so Hitler turns to the next item on his list, and it's a personal one. He is, remember, from Austria. From his youth, he believed German-speaking Austrians belonged in the German Reich, in the greater German state. And so he is determined to unite the two countries. The two countries he has to worry about in interfering with this are the United Kingdom and Italy. The United Kingdom, Britain, because they are basically the leading world power who often guarantee borders the way that the United States does today. And then Italy, because Austria is the border country between Germany and Italy, and so they'll have suspicion, might raise a stink if Germany invades Austria. So Hitler talks with Lord Halifax of Britain and is convinced that Britain will not intervene if they go into Austria. He also talks with Mussolini and is convinced that Italy will not intervene either. Hitler had actually been preparing the way for Italian acquiescence on this question for years, because one of the important issues to German nationalists was the return of this tiny region called South Tyrol to Austria. Okay, so South Tyrol is this region. It's either in, depending on how you think about it, the very far northeast of Italy or the very far southwest of Austria. Okay, so it's a border region between Austria and Italy. And it had been given to the Italians after World War I. but it doesn't have any Italians in it. It's filled with people who are ethnically and linguistically German. And so all these German and Austrian nationalists are outraged by this and want South Tyrol returned to Austria. That's what basically every German and Austrian nationalist wants. And Hitler is unusual among German nationalists in that he takes the other side of the issue. And his point is basically that we have this friendly regime, the fascist regime in Italy, Mussolini, and they're going to take care of these German folks in South Tyrol. Mussolini isn't going to persecute them. I want to be in good relations with him. He wants to be in good relations with us. It's worth leaving the issue alone so that we can keep good relations with Italy and Mussolini. And by the way, to help you kind of like visualize this area, right now the best tennis player in the world, Jannik Sinner, is from this region. So he's from Italy. If you see him playing, it'll have the Italian flag next to his name. But he's a 6'4" redhead. He doesn't look very Italian. And his name is Jannik. Right? That's a German name, not an Italian name. And in fact, German is his first language. And that's because he's from this very region, South Tyrol. Okay, so that's just a random aside to help you visualize where this area is. So it's a very unpopular opinion, but Hitler voices it for years. No, we should let Italy have South Tyrol. But as a consequence, Mussolini trusts Hitler when he tells him that he's going to invade Austria. It is still kind of touchy, but he's built enough trust with Mussolini to kind of even it out, iron it out, and work it out, and get Mussolini's quiet acceptance of an invasion of Austria. So I won't go into all the machinations that get them there. The Germans build up their forces. The British try to register a protest, and there's this shuttle diplomacy back and forth. There's a referendum in Austria, which Hitler wants canceled. Anyways, the upshot is that on March 12th, 1938, German troops cross the border and meet no military resistance. Cheering crowds greet them all along the way. On March 13th, this union is formalized by law. Austria becomes part of the German Reich. Hitler stages his triumphant Vienna rally on March 15th. And mass enthusiasm pushes him from gradual coordination to immediate annexation. The thought initially was, all right, we'll send our troops in, we'll take control of Austria, and then over time, we will incorporate their government into Germany. But everyone is so enthusiastic, the Austrians kind of get swept up in it too. He says, actually, scratch that. Starting right now, Austria is a full member, it's just a region of the greater German kingdom. There's a plebiscite held on April 10th to confirm the annexation. And, there's some chicanery, but even without it, it's extremely popular. And it passes with crushing majorities. So this is Hitler at his best. This is what he is great at. Propaganda, excitement, vision. And then you get the bad of Hitler at the same time. Obviously, his intentions are not pure, and the actual actions taken are probably even more extreme than even he would have wanted. As I said, again, working towards the Führer. And now you get that in this kind of new territory, new playground for people to play in of Austria. And so you have the Austrian National Socialists. You did have Austrian Nazis who had their own party and were doing their own thing. And they meet up with the SA and the SS and the Gestapo and all these other organizations. And they implement this reign of terror. Almost immediately, mass arrests, street violence, humiliation rituals, looting, terror, especially against the Jews. Many flee, some commit suicide. It's not all good in terms of how it's actually carried out. But in terms of his larger goals, Hitler has demonstrated something important, which is Britain, France, Russia, all these major powers are not going to act if we move boldly. Mussolini will not act. This strategy of highly aggressive gambits is working. And then this is important for another reason, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is Germany is running out of money, and essentially the Germans loot Austria. They go into their treasury and they take everything. And this happens just in time. It provides much needed cash to the German war machine. Okay, so attention turns immediately to the next target on the list, which is Czechoslovakia. why does Hitler want to go into Czechoslovakia? Publicly, he frames it as protecting the German minority in this region called the Sudetenland. All right. In the Sudetenland, Germans are a majority of the population. It's in western Czechoslovakia, bordering Germany. Privately, he's admitting he wants to destroy Czechoslovakia entirely, both to get more land, territory, wealth, but also because he kind of had this weird thing against the Czechs because of his upbringing in Austria. So by late May 1938, he tells the army both the goal and the timing. He accepts the risk of war with Britain and France, but ultimately he thinks it won't come to that. Once again, France is hesitant. The USSR is blocked by geography. It's really long distance from Czechoslovakia to Russia. Poland and Hungary are actually open to working with Germany because they are interested in making small territorial gains at the expense of Czechoslovakia. And once again, Italy is willing to stay neutral. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Neville Chamberlain, works hard to preserve peace with Germany. Again, remember, they've just gone through World War I. No one wants to see a return to that. And so he is happy to give numerous concessions if it will prevent Hitler from conducting a full-scale invasion of Czechoslovakia. He's saying, look, we can figure something out to get Sudetenland to Germany and peacefully transfer it over to you guys, and the Czechs will have to disarm in this way and that way, and all this stuff. I mean, he bends over backwards. And listen, Chamberlain has become synonymous with a policy of appeasement. And it's easy to look back on Chamberlain and look at his appeasement and see it as cowardice, as morally wrong. But I actually think Chamberlain deserves a little more credit, or at least a little more grace than that. Again, World War I had just happened. No one wants to see a return of the trenches, the mass slaughter. Like, people just did not want to go through that again. And Chamberlain knows that even if they go to war, the British population is just not going to go along with a full-throated, total war against the Germans. And so he proposes a four-power conference. Hitler reluctantly agrees, and on September 29th, Chamberlain, Daladier of France, Hitler, and Mussolini meet in Munich. They sign an agreement, the Munich Agreement. By October 10th, the Sudetenland will be German. The Czechs are not invited. The Czech government resigns in protest. Like, you're not inviting us to this conference to give away our territory to Germany. But it's kind of realpolitik, right? Like, yeah, ultimately what you want doesn't really matter. We can tell you what to do. Your army's not big enough. So Chamberlain returns home and tells the British public that he has brought them, quote, peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. A member of the opposition, Winston Churchill, watches and declares, you were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. Less than half a year later, Hitler breaks the Munich Pact, and on March 15th, 1939, German troops cross into Bohemia and Moravia, and Slovakia is made a German puppet. The thing about Sudetenland is that it's this very mountainous region, and so it actually provides a pretty good defensive border against Germany. And so if the Czechs had held on to the Sudetenland, then even though they have a far inferior army to the Germans, with this natural barrier of these mountains and all these defenses, they could have put up a pretty good fight against the Germans. It actually would have been pretty tough to take over Czechoslovakia. But with the Sudetenland gone, the Germans can really just plow through the Czechs and take over all of Czechoslovakia. That same day, Czech President Emil Hácha is summoned to Berlin. He is intimidated, threatened with the bombing of Prague, and he has a heart attack. It's like this whole thing, but ultimately he signs away Czech sovereignty. Unlike earlier annexations, he is intimidated, threatened. Like, Hitler uses all of these really coercive and like rude personal intimidation techniques against this man. It's like people consider it wildly inappropriate, a total breach of diplomatic protocol, but it kind of works. He eventually browbeats him into signing away Czech sovereignty. Unlike earlier annexations, the occupation meets sullen resignation from the German public. Like, Because for one, they already have the Sudetenland. The popular thing is, yes, let's bring Germans into the German Reich. But they are thinking, why are we taking over these Czech regions and Slovakia? And they're very nervous about war. They don't want another world war. They don't want another great war. And so Hitler's expecting, adulation and this big celebration like he had when he conquered Austria. He doesn't get that at all. The German people didn't want this war. And of course, this is the moment that breaks appeasement. Like I said, Neville Chamberlain had bent over backwards to appease Germany. And Britain and France conclude that German expansion aims at domination by force. And so they say, okay, we really can't give any more ground. And so they guarantee the territorial integrity of Poland. That's sort of the obvious next step for Germany. And for the first time, the West has drawn a line in the sand. They say, look, you have to hold it here. So look, the policy of appeasement is ultimately a failure. The reason I defend Neville Chamberlain a bit is I do think he did quite a bit to stop German expansion. Because if Hitler had simply invaded Czechoslovakia and the British had not appeased him first, I think most of the British public would have thought, well, what business of that is ours? I'm sorry for the Czechs, but that's a distant war that has nothing to do with us. And then if he had invaded Poland, they still would have been perturbed, but probably not enough to intervene. But by bending over backwards to appease Germany, by giving them multiple concessions in exchange for solid and well-understood promises of peace, what Chamberlain did was turn all of European public opinion against Hitler. It goes from an ideological debate of, okay, well, should Germany expand? Austrians are really Germans anyway. Don't we believe in nation states? Shouldn't all Germans be part of Germany? Shouldn't all of the nation be in one state? Or shouldn't it be? Austria has this historic state. Okay, it's just this kind of ideological debate. And it converts it into something that everyone can kind of agree on. This baseline morality of honesty. This man, Hitler, had given his word, had gotten all these concessions and said, in exchange, I will not invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then he had broken his word. He had lied. And now he was widely perceived as a man that could not be trusted. So counterfactuals are always difficult. I'm not saying Neville Chamberlain is a hero, but I also don't think he's the sniveling coward that he's sometimes portrayed to be. He was a pragmatic man who did everything he could to avoid war, and in so doing, exposed Hitler's real intentions and exposed his willingness to lie, to do anything to get what he wanted. This episode is brought to you by Zcash, and specifically by the Zcash-powered mobile wallet, Zodal. Zodal is the best way to send, receive, and pay with Zcash. Zcash is private money, so it's crypto that allows you to transact without anyone else knowing what you're doing. So if you're worried about tyranny, if you're worried about the direction of the way things are going in the world, then Zcash is a great hedge against that. And again, the best way to transact and to hold Zcash is in Zodal. So try out Zcash, try out Zodal. You can get that wherever you get your apps. Okay, so Britain and France have guaranteed the territorial integrity of Poland. There is a very famous, very successful German city in Poland called Danzig. Okay, there are a few German cities in Poland, and that's kind of Europe, right? These population distributions don't always match up to neat little lines. So you'll have German communities in Czechoslovakia, and you'll have Czech communities in Germany, and Polish communities in Germany, and German communities in Poland, whatever. But Danzig was a beautiful, successful, very famous, very prominent German city. And Hitler desperately wants to bring it in to Germany and establish a corridor to Danzig and unite it geographically with the rest of Germany. And he also wanted to turn Poland into a satellite state and establish Lebensraum there, living room, a place for excess German population to go and settle. So it's going to be a little dicey invading Poland when they have French and British support. So Hitler feels like he needs an ally to do this, to reassure his own population and maybe deter the French and British from actually intervening. So Hitler turns to the one country no one expected him to court, Russia. Hitler was the mortal enemy of Bolshevism. So this is unexpected that he's going to ally with the Soviets. But that's exactly what he does. He sends out feelers, and the Russians are open to it. And on August 23rd, 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, probably butchered that name, but Molotov and Ribbentrop sign a non-aggression pact in Moscow. It has secret protocols that divide Eastern Europe between them and divides Poland between them. And so it is secretly agreed that Russia will support a German invasion of Poland. Goebbels writes in his diary, "We're on top again. Now we can sleep more easily." On September 1st, 1939, 3 million German troops invade Poland. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, destroys the Polish Air Force in days. German tank divisions cut through Polish lines so fast that the world has to invent a new word for it: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tank divisions, supported by air power, punch holes in enemy lines. Non-mechanized forces follow. The tanks leap forward again, and this happens at an unbelievably fast pace that the Poles just can't keep up with. German soldiers take methamphetamine, Pervitin, which lets them fight for days without sleep. You can't fight endlessly on meth, but usually after a day, you'll need some sleep, or maybe you can stretch it to 2, but they can go 3.5 days without sleep, which is enough to really punch through. Britain and France declare war on September 3rd, but they do nothing to help Poland. They're just not in a state of readiness to actually put troops into the theater of Poland. On September 17th, the Red Army crosses the border from the east, and Germany actually pushes forward so fast that there was this agreement with the Soviets that the Germans are going to invade from the west, the Soviets will invade from the east. Actually, the Germans push beyond the line of demarcation, so they have to do this humiliating thing of, after they have basically taken all of Poland, they have to retreat to the agreed upon line and just hand over territory to the Russians. The Polish government surrenders on September 27th. Over 20,000 civilians are dead. German losses are 14,000 dead. Polish losses are 66,000 dead, 130,000 wounded, and 400,000 captured. Again, this isn't a history podcast, so I'm not going to document all of the German atrocities throughout the war, but it is worth noting that some of the worst atrocities of the war happen at this time in Poland. Again, Poland is seen as Lebensraum, as area that Germans are going to expand into. The problem is, what is Poland full of? Polish people. And so they need to be ethnically cleansed and moved in order to make room for this German territory. It's envisioned that Poland, they're not just going to completely ethnically cleanse all Poles from Poland, but they're going to cleanse about a third of it and cram all these Poles into just this one little strip within Poland, and the rest is going to be given over to German populations. Additionally, Germany had quite a few Jews, Austria had quite a few Jews, all of Europe had Ashkenazi Jews in it at this point. But Poland is the most Jewish of any country in Europe at the time. And you don't have to worry about the public opinion of Germans who, again, sort of urban, well-educated, well-heeled Germans don't like anti-Semitism. And so while anti-Semitism was bad in Germany, it was always tempered a little bit by public opinion. Most people didn't want to go along with it. In Poland, the Nazis don't have to worry about that. And so they kind of have a free hand. And so this is at a time when all these camps have not really been established yet. So most of the Jews who die in Poland are simply shot, as are many of the Poles are just shot. So some of the worst atrocities of all of World War II happened at this time of the German invasion of Poland. Actually, another thing to note about that is over time, the German military becomes more and more radicalized But at the beginning of the war, the German military still had an ethos of professionalism. And so they actually have to kind of be worked around. So you have these marauding SS units that go through and carry out most of the atrocities. Most of the soldiers of the German army at this point in time are looking around going, what is going on? Like, this is not what we do. Some of them can be enticed to partake in some of these atrocities, but for the most part, they're pretty uncomfortable with it. And it's sort of the most extreme paramilitary units that do all of the atrocities in Poland. Ian Kershaw writes, in what had once been Poland, the violence was unconstrained, systematic, and on a scale never witnessed within the Reich itself. Law, however draconian, counted for nothing. Poland will eventually have the third highest death toll of any country in World War II, 5 to 6 million dead, including its Jewish population almost entirely exterminated. Okay, so that's Poland. Britain and France have declared war, but they don't act. They don't do anything. From September 1939 to May 1940, both sides sit behind their defenses. The press calls this the Phony War. Sometimes some call it the Boer War, right? That's a play on words. You have the Boer War in South Africa. They call this the Boer War. It's boring because nothing happened. Or the Sitzkrieg, right? You have the Blitzkrieg, the Sitzkrieg. Everyone's just sitting around doing nothing. France actually, when it breaks out, in the middle of this phony war, they sort of tiptoe into Germany a little bit. And German forces just withdraw to solid defenses and just wait. And the French kind of can't bring themselves after the horrors of World War I to strike first. So they kind of tiptoe in, they look around. The German citizens kind of greet them, say, hello, what's up? And there are like, I think a couple dozen deaths on either side, and then they just go back to their own side. It's actually in the middle of this phony war that the World War II almost ends before it begins. There's this kind of ordinary, actually, German worker who very painstakingly sets up this elaborate contraption to try and blow up Hitler during one of his famous speeches, and it's very close. Unfortunately, Hitler leaves the meeting a little bit early. The bomb goes off. It doesn't get him. So yeah, the bomb is set to go off at 9:20, and Hitler finishes his speech at 9:07, and he's not even in the building when the bomb goes off. 8 people are killed, 63 are injured. Hitler has been gone less than 10 minutes. Actually, the only outcome of this is that Hitler attributes his salvation to Providence. He starts to see himself in even more messianic terms of, I can't be killed. Look at this. Look how God or fate saved me from this assassination attempt. So Hitler survives, and the phony war ends in the spring of 1940. The first real fighting actually starts in Norway. This is a part of the war not many people know about. I won't go over all the details. The important thing to know is that it's seen as sort of a boondoggle for the British because they invade Norway before Germany. They compromise Norway's sovereign integrity, and all for nothing because they give up the territory very easily and the Germans take it over. They're there because they knew the Germans wanted to go there in order to acquire all these natural resources that are going to be necessary for fighting the war. Now, it's kind of gone down in history as something of a boondoggle for the British. Sort of true. However, it is worth noting that the German Navy suffers a really bad blow. And what this means is that the German Navy is not going to, let alone defeat the British Navy. They never would have been able to do that. But now they really can't even slow the British Navy down. And so the British really have control of the North Sea for the rest of the war. Okay, on May 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain. The same day, Germany invades France. Now, the Army High Command in Germany had originally planned a conventional attack through the lowlands of Belgium. Hitler thought it was too predictable. He pushes for something more daring, a main thrust through the Ardennes, which is this forest. The Army High Command thinks this is too risky. The terrain is wooded and difficult. Tanks will struggle. Hitler insists. He says, no, the most important thing is surprise, is doing something that they won't see coming. While Allied forces counter the expected attack through Belgium, armored units of Army Group A will rapidly drive through the Ardennes into the lowlands of northern France toward the coast, scything through Allied forces and pushing them into the path of Army Group B advancing from the north. It is called the Sickle Cut Plan, and it works perfectly. Sometimes people argue about whether Hitler was a military genius or a bumbling idiot. And my answer to that is yes, because throughout World War II, he will be both. But during this time, you really can't call him anything other than a genius. You know, the military group really wants to do something else. And he's involved with the details of the planning. You know, other people, of course, are involved in the planning. He takes other plans and modifies them. But this is really Hitler's plan. And it is a phenomenal success. The Dutch surrender within 5 days. The Belgians surrender shortly thereafter on May 28th. By May 21st, German tanks had reached the Channel coast. The Allied armies are cut in two. And then comes Dunkirk. So the British have landed an expeditionary force in France to help France defend against Hitler. And with this scything technique, he has cut off the British, along with many French forces, in this town in northern France called Dunkirk. On May 24th, Hitler agrees to halt the tanks. The order does not actually originate with him. It comes from this guy named Rundstedt, who's one of his most trusted generals, who wants to conserve the tanks for the upcoming operations in the south. And Goering, who has been put in charge of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, promises that he can finish off the encircled Allies from the air. And so Hitler agrees. It is a mistake. The Luftwaffe cannot deliver. Bad weather and the RAF prevent the easy pickings Goering had imagined. The RAF fight very bravely all throughout the war, but especially at this time. By the time Hitler reverses the order on May 26th, the British have organized the Dunkirk evacuation. Almost 340,000 British and French soldiers escape across the Channel. If they had been captured, Churchill probably could not have survived politically, and another government would have come into power in Britain that would have been forced to sue for peace with Hitler. But that didn't happen, and Britain stays in the war. Now, it is worth pointing out that sometimes it is portrayed that they were just sitting ducks in Dunkirk, and the Germans could have done whatever they wanted with them, and they inexplicably stopped. That's not quite true. Knowing what we know now, yes, Hitler, if he wanted to win the war, should have done whatever he could have to smash the troops at Dunkirk. He should have thrown everything at them at that pivotal moment. But it's not like they had no materials. They would have just given up without a fight. They would have easily been smashed. No, British forces were very disciplined. The French forces, who up to this point had given up without a fight, had their backs against the wall. And actually on the outskirts of Dunkirk, they do fight very bravely. It would have been very difficult street-to-street fighting throughout Dunkirk. So while it is a blunder on the part of Hitler and his top generals, it's actually a very understandable one. And if they had been able to smash the British troops, A, they never would have gotten all of them. Some would have evacuated. And B, it would have been very costly to wipe them out at Dunkirk. Okay, but at the time, this seems not great, but not like a disaster. Because on June 14th, 1940, less than 5 weeks after the offensive began, German troops enter Paris. Ian Kershaw writes, quote, "A generation earlier, the fathers and uncles of these soldiers had fought for 4 years and not reached Paris. Now the German troops had achieved it in a little over 4 weeks." On June 17th, the French government sues for peace. Hitler slaps his thigh in joy when he hears the news. Allied losses are around 90,000 dead, 200,000 wounded, and 1.9 million captured. German dead are under 30,000. On June 28th, Hitler pays his only visit to Paris. He arrives early in the morning with his architects, Hermann Geisler and Albert Speer, and his favorite sculptor, Arno Breker. They tour the opera, the Madeleine, the Champs-Élysées, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the Eiffel Tower, and most importantly to Hitler, the Tomb of Napoleon. Hitler actually says that his visit to the Tomb of Napoleon is the most impactful moment of his life. Hitler tells Albert Speer that seeing Paris had been the dream of his lifetime. He had considered destroying it, but he remarks, quote, "When we're finished in Berlin, Paris will only be a shadow. Why should we destroy it?" In Berlin, Hitler is greeted as the greatest warlord of all time. The streets are strewn with flowers all the way from the station to the Reich Chancellery. Hundreds of thousands cheer themselves hoarse. I had said previously that the German public was very reluctant about war. And that's true. They were. And when they invade Poland, the German public is not enthusiastic at all. When they invade France, the German public is not enthusiastic at all. But you can't argue with results, right? And so it's really a feeling of relief of, hey, we were afraid that there might be another great war, but clearly there's not going to be. We spent all this time in World War I fighting France. And look at this. We knocked them out in 5 weeks. And so people are relieved. They are exultant. They can't believe it. Hitler is called out time after time to the balcony to soak up the wild adulation of the masses. Even opponents of the regime find it hard to resist the victorious mood. Hitler is, at this moment, the master of continental Europe, from the Pyrenees to the Polish-Soviet border, from Austria to Denmark. He is the greatest warlord since Napoleon. Only Britain stands in the way of peace and complete conquest. Now, Hitler expects Britain to come to terms. Why wouldn't they? They have been beaten. They have no allies left on the continent. What are you going to do if you're Britain? So he offers peace in his Reichstag speech of July 19th, 1940. And he believes he's being generous. He's like, look, I beat you guys, but guess what? I'm not going to ask anything of you. You guys can keep your empire. I just want to be the master of Western Europe. But Churchill rejects it. And so the Battle of Britain begins. From July through September 1940, the Luftwaffe attacks British radar stations, fighter bases, factories. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, smaller but with the home advantage, takes heavy losses but inflicts heavier ones on the Germans. In early September, German bombers accidentally hit civilian areas of London, and the British retaliate with a bombing raid on Berlin. This makes Hitler furious, and it's really a strike at his pride. These strikes at this point, they're basically pinpricks. But it shows that Hitler is not completely the master of the situation, that Britain still has the power to inflict pain on Germany itself. And so Hitler shifts the Luftwaffe from attacking the British Air Force to attacking London and other cities in retaliation. He's saying, hey, you're going to bomb civilian areas of Berlin, then we're going to attack civilian areas of England. And this is a strategic mistake. It relieves the pressure on the British Air Force, the RAF, at a time when, they're kind of winning, but they are embattled and they are reeling. By mid-September, Fighter Command has demonstrated that the Luftwaffe cannot gain air superiority over Britain. And on September 14th, Hitler accepts that an invasion of Britain is impossible. He had developed something called Operation Sea Lion, which is to say, hey, let's get just enough air superiority and just enough naval power to hold back the British Navy, and we can launch an amphibious landing in England and knock them out of the war. But without the air superiority necessary, it's clear that this is never going to happen. The night bombing of London continues until May 1941, becomes known as the Blitz. It causes mass civilian casualties, but it does not break British morale. So Hitler is kind of at this point where he's saying, okay, well, what do I do? The British really don't have the power to push me back or invade Europe, but neither do I have the power to invade Britain. And it's kind of driving him crazy. And he wants this to be over. He wants not just to hold an uneasy detente, he wants to win the war. And so he comes up with this idea. which is he says to himself, all right, what is keeping the British going? What is keeping them going is this idea that, okay, we can't invade German holdings in Europe, but there is this other power still there that we could potentially eventually ally with, and that is Russia. And so it is the hope of maybe someday allying with Russia to defeat Hitler that is keeping Britain going. And so Hitler comes up with the idea, okay, well, if we can just do to Russia what we did to France, then we can knock Russia out of the war, and then Britain will have to sue for peace. We now know that this was a huge mistake. At the time, though, it seems very reasonable. Why? Because in World War I, the French had put up much stiffer resistance than the Russians. And the Russians had eventually, it went so badly for them that they suffered an internal revolution and had to pull out of the war. The Germans essentially won on the Eastern Front. And so, Hitler's thinking to himself, the French are much tougher to deal with than the Russians. So if we knocked out the French in 5 weeks, imagine how easy the Russians are going to be. So just a couple of months after all of this, he decides on a strategy of invading Russia. Now, there's other stuff going on. Again, World War II is a vast war. There's a Yugoslavian theater that we're just going to have to skip over. There's a whole theater in Greece with Mussolini and the Italians invading Greece and the Germans having to rescue them. There's action that happens in Africa with the Italians invading Somalia and Ethiopia. That had happened earlier, and there's some action there. There's Crete. We're just going to skip over all that stuff because this is, again, a podcast not about World War II, but about Hitler. So we're going to kind of skip forward to the invasion of Russia. Okay, so as I said, on December 18th, 1940, Hitler authorizes preparations. The operation is called Barbarossa after the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who attempted to establish German dominance over Europe. Hitler tells his inner circle, quote, "Whether right or wrong, we must win. That is the only way. And it is morally right and necessary. And when we have won, who will ask us about the method?" The invasion actually starts on June 22nd, 1941. By a quirk of history, it is exactly the same date that Napoleon's Grand Army marched on Russia 129 years earlier. Not a good sign. If you're looking for a sign from the heavens, marching on Russia on the exact same date as Napoleon did is not what you want to do. Over 3 million German troops crossed the border. They deploy 3,600 tanks, 600,000 motorized vehicles, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 aircraft, and, like Napoleon's army, 625,000 horses. It is, according to one historian, the largest and most powerful invasion force in human history. Facing them are 3 million Soviet soldiers with as many as 14,000 to 15,000 tanks, 34,000 artillery pieces, and 8,000 to 9,000 fighter aircraft. Yes, the Soviets had 2 to 3 times the number of tanks and aircraft as the Germans, but Stalin had misread Hitler. He refuses to authorize defensive measures, even when intel reports are coming in, hey, the Germans are building up their forces, it sure looks like a surprise invasion is coming. Stalin just refuses to believe it. He says, no, Hitler won't do it this early, even if he is going to betray us. And so the Soviets are really unprepared when this invasion happens. Whole Soviet formations are exposed to encirclement. German pincer operations produce enormous Soviet losses. Millions are captured, wounded, or killed by autumn 1941. Through early 1941, it looks like everything is going great. Like Hitler is the genius once again, that he was right, that Russia is going to fall even easier than France did.
If you've been listening to this show for a while, you have heard me advertise Founders. Well, now the host of Founders, David Senra, has a new show where he interviews some of the greatest living founders. And I mean the greats. He's got long-form conversations with people like Daniel Ek of Spotify, Michael Dell, and Michael Ovitz of CAA. They are very in-depth conversations that really strike at the heart of what motivates them, how they think, and what actions they have taken to become the greats in their industries. I really love it. It's another great podcast from David Senra. So check it out. That podcast is called simply David Senra, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. By late September, the Germans are on the edge of Leningrad, the city now known as St. Petersburg. Hitler establishes the Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia. So that's part of Germany, Poland, on the far eastern part of his territory, to be closer to the Eastern Front, which he viewed as the decisive front of this war. And he expects to stay for a few weeks. He stays for 3.5 years. In the early weeks, his mood is ebullient. He's excited, he's happy, he predicts imminent triumph. Goebbels records his belief on July 8th that victory is largely secured. They have encircled these huge detachments of Soviet forces. But obviously, victory is not secured. Why is it not secured? Actually, Hitler could have been right. This is one of my controversial opinions. Hitler could have been right. The war basically could have been over. Under what conditions could it have been over? It could have been over if he had at least said, look, Russia, this is really just against the Soviets. We're going to restore a white Russia. We're going to be kind to you. We're going to look to work with opposition leaders, and we're going to look to install a non-Soviet Russian regime in Russia. And I think there would have been mass defections. What does he do instead? He basically conducts a genocidal war of extermination. And so, what are the Russians going to do? They're going to fight like dogs, right? They're going to fight like they are facing genocide, which they basically are. So wherever they come across Jews, they are either putting them in camps or they are killing them. But it's not just Jews, it is the Russians as well. The Russians are really getting extermination treatment as well. And so they fight like their backs are to the wall, and no alternative sources of leadership emerge from within Russia. It's the Soviet regime or nothing. There are no defections, no one coming over to the German side. Now, from Hitler's perspective, who cares? This is going to be easy. We have already surrounded huge detachments of Russian forces. These guys are not the French. They're not a well-trained military. This is what Hitler believes. And so he believes that the whole thing is about to fall apart. Now, this is where I have to push back on probably the simplified narrative that you have heard. And the narrative that we understandably get, because it's just simpler, is that Hitler invades Russia in winter and it goes disastrously wrong. And through a battle of attrition, the Germans are defeated. And actually, at first, the invasion Barbarossa goes extremely well. However, they did underestimate the difficulty of how hard it would be to push all the way into Russia. Russia is huge. I think it's difficult to understate how large Russia is. I know that's like sort of an obvious thing, but you also might look at Russia and you see all that eastern territory. And maybe you think, well, yeah, but it's just all this like Siberia and all this Arctic land, which is mostly like not useful, not what we're talking about. Okay. But the truth is that actually, even if you just take Russia west of the Urals, so that's just European Russia, that's just the part in the very far west, it's about 11 times larger than Germany. 11 times larger than Germany. If you go to Russia and you kind of tour around, which I've done, you might go from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and it's a few hour train ride. And those two cities, like you consider them next to each other, right? There's no large cities in between St. Petersburg and Moscow. You could fit all of Germany in between St. Petersburg and Moscow. Russia is very, very large. I don't know how to emphasize this enough. Very, very large. And so they're beating Russian forces when they come into contact with them. But they're just having trouble keeping their tanks in action, resupplying them. There aren't great roads. There aren't great train lines, train tracks to keep them supplied. And so actually, not through really Soviet actions,
The Soviet forces are still in disarray, but just through logistical breakdown, they're unable to get as far as they want. So you have to think of like a trident. There's a north invasion force going towards St. Petersburg, and then there's a central invasion force going towards Moscow, and then there's a southern invasion force that peels off and goes into Ukraine. I hadn't even counted Ukraine. If you count Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union at the time, you're actually probably looking at like 12 or 13 times bigger than Germany. Okay. So they're quickly realizing, even though they're beating the Soviet forces pretty easily with each of these prongs, there's this logistical breakdown, and so they're not going to be able to accomplish all of their objectives before the winter sets in. So, and then they do finally start to face, the Russians are kind of able to get their act together, get organized, and put up some stiff resistance in front of Moscow, right in front of Moscow. The German forces are actually able to get so far that they can see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. They can literally see Moscow, okay? But that's where they face real stiff Russian resistance. And so they're not going to be able to take St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the oil fields of Ukraine. So Hitler says, okay, let's peel off some of our forces from the central strike force going towards Moscow and send them into Ukraine to make sure that we get the oil fields in Ukraine and then later in the Caucasus. Let's get all of those materials. Now, probably this is the last point at which Hitler could have won the war. If instead of going for those resources, he had said, hey, if we actually just knock out Moscow, maybe the entire government will crumble and the Russians will give up. Maybe that would have worked. Many historians think that would have worked. I actually think even that would not have worked. Why? Again, because Hitler is giving them no way out. He is fighting a war of extermination against the Russians. So I think even if he had taken Moscow, they just would have retreated to Ekaterinburg or some other city that is east of the Urals, regrouped and continued to fight on. So, maybe it's just not winnable. So they do essentially take the physical resources to be found in Ukraine. But they don't take St. Petersburg. They don't take Moscow. And on December 5th, 1941, the Soviets launched a winter counteroffensive. German commanders began pulling back to defensible positions. Many German generals actually wanted to call for an all-out retreat, which is an interesting moment, an interesting counterfactual. What would have happened if the Germans had pulled back entirely? Could that have saved the war? I've read a number of assessments. I think I actually agree most with the assessment that says, no, Hitler actually made the right call in refusing to issue a full-on retreat, because it probably would have turned into a rout and the Germans would have lost even sooner in Russia. So there's a counteroffensive in December. Hitler orders the Germans to hold, and they are able to hold through the winter of 1941 to 1942. So by January of 1942, the line in Russia is stabilized. Now, while we're in this moment, we have to take a look at one other factor in Hitler underestimating the Soviet Union. Because, I just said Russia's big, okay? Turns out Germans can read maps. It turns out they knew that it was big. And I don't think they fully understood the logistical nightmares they would have getting into Russia. But what happened? What were they not accounting for? There is one more factor that I think historians sometimes underweight. The United States was not yet officially in World War II. But through the Lend-Lease program signed by Roosevelt in March of 1941, America was already supplying Britain, and soon the Soviet Union as well, with massive amounts of war material. And this is what Hitler did not fully reckon with. The combined economies of the British Empire and America considerably exceeded the German area of control. Even when you're including France and Poland and Czechoslovakia and Austria and all these other areas, American factories were beginning to produce trucks and tanks and aircraft and ammunition on a scale that would dwarf German output. And those supplies were flowing to the Soviets. Now, if you look at raw numbers, Americans are only supplying something like 15 to 20% of Russian war material. So you're like, 15 to 20%, that seems significant, but is that really what can turn the tide of a war? And the answer is yes. And the reason is it's not just the 15 to 20%, it's what that represents, which is America is not at war. And their factories are functioning at full capacity. They're not in any danger. And so they're basically Amazon for Russia. The Russians, the Soviets, can just order whatever they need from the Americans. So it's not just the amount that they produce, it's that the Russians can say, oh, wow, this is kind of random, but we're running out of copper wire. Can you guys ship us massive amounts of copper wire? Yes, we can. Hey, we didn't see this coming, but we're running out of, we have enough tanks, but we're running out of supply trucks. Can you get us trucks? Yes, we can get you trucks. So it's not just the amount of materials that are transported, but it's that the Americans can get them exactly what they need right when they need it. So the radios the Red Army used, the boots they wore, the train tracks that they laid, all this sorts of stuff, a staggering amount of it came from American factories. So Hitler was now fighting not just the Soviet Union, he was fighting the Soviet Union plus the industrial capacity of the United States, even before America officially entered the war. And then he made the formal declaration himself. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Hitler is delighted. He believes Japan's entry will tie down the United States in the Pacific and weaken Britain in Asia. On December 11th, 1941, he formally declares war on the United States. This is one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. He didn't have to do it. The tripartite pact only required Germany to come to Japan's aid if Japan itself was attacked, and Japan was the attacker at Pearl Harbor. But Hitler had already secretly committed Germany not to make a separate peace with the United States, and he saw Pearl Harbor as a propaganda opportunity. So he formally went to war with the most powerful industrial nation on the planet, while already at war with the British Empire and the Soviet Union. He was now fighting all three. And look, I actually think that you can make a case that this is one of the worst strategic decisions in all of world history. I think one of the major considerations is that Hitler is saying to himself, well, look, we're basically fighting America already. What's the difference? Let's just make it official, right? I actually think that Putin, in his war with Ukraine, learned this lesson from Hitler, because you'll notice that You'll notice that Putin never declared war on the United States, even though the Americans are giving money, missiles, materials, weapons, logistical support, intel, communications, satellite intel to the Ukraine. Like, America has been essentially fighting Russia in Ukraine in the last, I'm talking about now, in the war that started in 2022. America has basically been at war with Russia using Ukrainian troops. I think Putin looked at Hitler and said, okay, actually it turns out there's a big difference between basically being at war with America and actually being at war with America. And so Hitler thinks, yeah, there's basically no difference. We're basically already at war with America. They're supplying materials to the United Kingdom, to the Soviet Union. What's the difference? Well, turns out there's a pretty big difference. So in 1942, Hitler is officially at war with the United States, and he interprets his survival of the previous winter as a personal triumph of the will. He dismissed the strategic flaws in Barbarossa and blamed his generals, who, besides, had wanted to full-on retreat. He had stopped the retreat and held the line in Russia. So he became obsessed with regaining the initiative through a massive gamble called Operation Blue, a drive toward the Caucasus oil fields. All right, so they've already captured some oil, some mines, some wheat fields, important materials in Ukraine. But in Georgia, Armenia, southern Russia, in this area, in the Caucasus, There are these huge oil fields, Baku oil fields. And so he says, we need this oil in order to keep our war machine going. And this is where the wheels really start to come off. The original plan was reasonable. A 1.5 million man German army would advance to Astrakhan, then south to the Caucasus. Hitler decided this was too simple, so he split the forces. They would attack the Caucasus and Stalingrad simultaneously with separate army groups. So, all his army commanders said, we're overextended. There's no way we can do both these things. And they were right. Operation Blue began on June 28th, 1942. There were some, initial successes. Voronezh fell, Sevastopol fell, but then progress starts to slow. Over in the Caucasus, they are very, very, very far from their supply lines. So they make it there to the oil fields, but this has taken so long that the Russians have long since destroyed the oil facilities and made them completely unusable to the Germans. And this is not something that you can quickly, get a couple engineers in and fix. No, this is going to be like a major industrial project to get these oil fields up and running again. So the Operation Blue is bogged down in the Caucasus, and then Stalingrad. Stalingrad, St. Petersburg, major industrial city. There is probably an element of personal vendetta because it's Stalin's city, right? It bore the name of the Soviet leader who Hitler was fighting. And capturing it would have been a massive propaganda victory and would have severed Soviet north-south transport links along the Volga. It turns out to be a massive, massive quagmire. Germans just keep throwing more and more units into Stalingrad, and the Russians are tough as nails and fight down to the bone in Stalingrad. The Germans push really hard. They almost take Stalingrad, and then there's a counterattack by the Russians. They attack from the flanks, and they actually mostly attack Allied forces. So these are Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. And quite frankly, these people are not as motivated as the Germans. They're not as well supplied, and they're undermanned. And they don't fight well. They don't fight hard. They probably didn't have the capabilities anyway, and they are quickly encircled by the Soviets. German high command urges Hitler to allow a breakout, and Hitler refuses. So this is the thing about Hitler. He's a brilliant strategist when strategy calls for surprise and initiative. But he had no flexibility whatsoever. When it came to turning and fighting a defensive war, he just didn't have the mental flexibility to do it. He knew one note, and that was attack, attack, attack. And so he refuses to allow this breakout. The Sixth Army would stand and fight to the last man. Eventually, the German general on the ground disobeys and surrenders. 22 generals and 91,000 starving men, almost none of whom would make it home alive, surrender to the Soviets. Total casualties for Germans and their allies from Stalingrad are believed to have been about 800,000 dead. The Soviets recovered 250,000 German and Romanian corpses around Stalingrad alone. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only about 5,000 ever returned home. And so, again, there is a lesson here that the same no-retreat instinct that worked in the winter of 1941 when the front line could be held by sheer willpower, that works against him. So there's something to be said for having the mental flexibility to understand that not every lesson works in every situation. You have to be flexible, and you have to be willing to deal with the circumstances as they actually are, and not just say, ooh, I found the secret to life. This one secret trick worked. I'm going to play it again and again and again. No, you need to respond to circumstances. And this is all proven out by, after this defeat at Stalingrad, rather than retrenching and forming up a defensive line on the Eastern Front, he tries another offensive after this defeat. They have a slight victory at Kharkov. It's actually a pretty good victory at Kharkov. And so he says, great, we got the initiative again. we're going to do Operation Citadel, which is another large offensive against the Soviets, and is attacking the city of Kursk. The Soviets predicted the attack. They had spies and signal intelligence. They knew it was coming. So they withdrew their main forces from the weak forward positions. Hitler and his generals actually hesitate for a little long. They could have surprised them, but they miss the boat. And the Soviets retreat and build deep anti-tank defenses, minefields, reinforced positions. Hitler was waiting for these new tanks, these Tigers, Panthers, Panzers, right? And the Panzers are magnificent tanks, but they're not really ready for prime time, and they're difficult to repair. They don't make a big difference. And so the attack begins on July 5th, 1943. German forces only advance 10 miles in the north, 30 miles in the south before they are counterattacked by the Soviets. The result is the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, 4,000 aircraft, and the Germans are soundly defeated. From Kursk onward, Germany never regained the initiative on the Eastern Front. And the bad news was not confined to the East. I've mostly been talking about the Eastern Front because that's where Hitler is, that's what he was focused on. But in Africa, the British have managed to gain a toehold. There's a large tank battle in North Africa. Hitler has this general, Erwin Rommel, who's this brilliant general. Everyone thinks he's brilliant. And at first, Rommel is able to hold back the Allies, but there are just too many British forces. And so he is forced to withdraw to Italy. Then the Allies land at Sicily, then in Italy, and they are slowly forcing back the Germans in the West as well, and the Italians, all their Allied forces. In 1943, Mussolini is overthrown. The Germans actually rescue him and bring him back to Germany, but Italy is not an ally anymore. So the Southern Front is kind of collapsing, while the Eastern Front is collapsing as well. So where do you hold out hope if you're Hitler? He does still have hope, and he thinks he can win the war. And here's how he thinks he can win the war. Is the different interests of the Allied forces. You know, American interests are not necessarily aligned with British interests, are not necessarily aligned with Soviet interests. And so he says, look, we just have to put up a stiff resistance, and one of these partners is going to say, hey, this isn't worth it, and they will turn and make a separate peace with us, and maybe it's the Soviets, and then we can just turn and use all those forces to fight the Americans and the British and regain the initiative. This never happens. And that's because the Allies talk while the Axis doesn't, right? Throughout the war, Hitler had a very poor relationship with both of his major allies, Japan and Italy. With Mussolini, the relationship had always been lopsided. Mussolini was definitely a junior partner. Anything that the Italians tried to do on their own initiative really failed. And so by the end of the war, the Italians are just doing whatever the Germans tell them to do, and they're not much help. And with Japan, the coordination was even worse. They were on opposite sides of the planet. Their war aims were different. Hitler, in fact, is a little embarrassed by his alliance with the Japanese. And that's because the Japanese are fighting British interests in Asia. So he's got this racial worldview. And so these Nazis, these other National Socialists are like, hey, how come we're helping Asians fight white people in Asia? Basically, kind of boils down to that. And he tells them, this is just a war of convenience. We'll be done with the Japanese once we win the war. So there's not like a close working partnership. And, actually, if he'd been smart about it, he could have teamed up with the Japanese to knock out the Soviet Union, could have attacked them from two sides. And then the Japanese would have had an easier time turning all their forces towards the Americans, and the Germans could have turned west, and that would have been an effective way of coordinating. Instead, the opposite happens, actually. The Japanese know that the Americans are sending all these materials to the Soviets across the Pacific. They're sending them right by Japan, okay? So the Japanese are just watching all these American materials go to fight the Germans, and they just let them go. their attitude is, well, if all these guns and tanks and trucks are going to fight the Soviets, that means they're not being used to fight us. So the Japanese just let it happen. And so Hitler doesn't coordinate at all with his allies. Whereas the allies, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets coordinate all the time. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had massive ideological and strategic disagreements. With the Americans, you have a capitalist democracy. With the British, you have a constitutional monarchy with a vast colonial empire. And with the Soviets, you have a totalitarian communist state. But they coordinated brilliantly. And that starts at the very beginning with the Atlantic Charter in 1941, the Casablanca Conference in 1943, where they declared the policy of unconditional surrender, to the Tehran Conference at the end of 1943, to ultimately the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, to the Potsdam Conference after Hitler's death. At Yalta, the three powers reaffirmed their commitment to total Allied victory. No separate peace, no split between East and West. Germany would surrender unconditionally to all of them together, or not at all. And this is a great strategic accomplishment on the one hand, because it does lock Germany into a war it could not win. Although, from my perspective, it is worth pausing to consider whether the Allies got everything right. Some historians have argued that the absolute commitment to unconditional surrender and the refusal of a separate peace with Germany may have been a mistake by the Americans and the British. Why? Some senior figures in the German military leadership, especially after the failure of the July 1944 plot, there was a plot to kill Hitler. So some German military leadership would have been happy to sign a separate peace with the West. They wanted to keep fighting the Soviets. They wanted to use German troops to hold off the Red Army. So imagine for a moment that the Western Allies had cut a deal. The Germans surrender to the British and Americans. Hitler is out of power, but there are no wide-scale prosecutions of Nazi leadership. Okay, that probably would have been a condition of the surrender. So Germans surrender to the British and Americans, who advance to Berlin and beyond, and they're basically able to hold the Soviets outside of Poland, maybe Czechoslovakia, all of Germany. So these are territories, countries that would have avoided 50 years of communist rule. So the result might have been a post-war Europe where the Iron Curtain fell on the Vistula, not the Elbe. Anyway, counterfactuals are counterfactuals. It's hard to know. I mean, frankly, a big consideration in all this is that FDR, definitely not Churchill, but FDR was communist sympathetic. He probably wasn't an outright communist himself, but he was something of a fellow traveler. He was definitely a leftist. And I think he thought the Russians, they're doing communism wrong. They're doing it Russian style, right? They're messing everything up. Look at the success we have had with the New Deal, with doing communism American Western style. But so he thought that they were doing things the wrong way, but he fundamentally didn't have a difference in worldview with the Soviets the way he did with the Nazis. And so he thought that he could work with Stalin. He thought that after the war, he was going to be able to keep Stalin contained on his side, and it's fine. The Soviets will have a seat at the table in the post-war order, and we'll work together, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, all of that is neither here nor there, right? This isn't a podcast about this. This is a podcast about Hitler. So Hitler, he is just watching the Southern Front crumble. He's watching the Eastern Front crumble. And then on June 6, 1944, D-Day happens, and American, British, and Canadian forces land in northern France, and a Western Front is established as well. And look, I mean, to be honest, World War II was always going to be a long shot for Hitler to win. Germany is not a big country. And the industrial output of Britain, the Soviet Union, and America were greater than that of Germany, each individually. let alone when you combine them all together, right? It would have taken a miracle to win World War II. But then you combine the fact that he's refusing to make trade-offs. He's refusing to make strategic retreats. He often vacillates in his decisions. He really comes at anyone very harshly who gives him bad news. He has a reluctance to face difficult facts. He only wants to go on the offensive. Overall, this strategy of optimism, vision, always forward, always audacity, always doing the unexpected, that worked for taking power and for prosecuting the early days of the war. But his leadership style was completely unsuited to a complex war of attrition that required very careful coordination across many different fronts and a complex industrial economy that needed to supply different theaters of the war, as well as aircraft, submarines, tanks, infantry. And it really just breaks down in the 1940s. The last chance that Germany has at not being completely devastated is on July 20th, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in a briefcase at Hitler's military conference at the Wolf's Lair. The bomb goes off right next to Hitler. There were supposed to be 2 briefcases, but they only managed to get one. Stauffenberg looks back at the building where Hitler is, and he sees all the windows blow out, this huge explosion, smoke coming out of the building, and he goes off and he telephones the rest of the conspirators saying, it worked. Hitler is dead. He thinks that there is no way that Hitler survived. And several people are killed. Hitler was wounded and pretty badly wounded, but he survived, and once again attributes his survival to Providence. He told Mussolini that day, "When I go through it all again, I conclude from my wondrous salvation, while others present in the room received serious injuries, that nothing is going to happen to me. I am ever more convinced that it is given to me to lead our common cause to a victorious end." So Stauffenberg is trying to do the right thing, but actually has a disastrous result, because Hitler just completely delusionally continues to believe that somehow, even though he is losing on 3 fronts and losing badly, and the war is in a death spiral downwards, he believes that Providence has preserved him for a purpose, and he is going to find a way to turn this war around. He has all these arm and leg injuries, and he's having all these other physical symptoms. He's desperately sick. He probably has Parkinson's disease. He's on a number of drugs that his quack doctor is giving him. He's experiencing horrible insomnia. He's got dizziness, tremors, swelling in his limbs, stomach spasms, jaundice, weight loss. Hitler is in a really bad state. Finally, all these forces are closing in from every side, and Hitler has to go to Berlin to issue his last commands. So in early 1945, Hitler is in a bunker in Berlin. He has to issue orders from a bunker because Berlin is being bombed so frequently by the Allies. The atmosphere in the Berlin bunker was exhaustion, dread, collapse. Soviet forces were already at Berlin's gates. Most senior Nazi leaders used the occasion to prepare their escape, which at first Hitler is upset about, but then for many people, he finally recognizes that the end is coming. There's no saving it. And he gives some people his tacit approval to leave and save themselves. On April 22nd, shortly after a birthday celebration, he learned that a hoped-for SS counterattack had not taken place, had not even been attempted. And so now he realizes the situation is so far gone that my orders aren't even being obeyed. And Hitler suffered a total emotional collapse. He announced betrayal by the army and SS. He openly declared the war lost. He announced his intention to remain in Berlin and commit suicide. I haven't talked much about his personal life, but he had a close personal female companion named Eva Braun, and Eva Braun chooses to stay with him. So did the Goebbels family. By April 24th, Berlin was fully encircled. and the Battle of Berlin was in its closing days. Just before midnight on April 28th in the bunker, Hitler, in an odd decision, married Eva Braun. The ceremony was conducted by an official in Nazi uniform with an armband. Goebbels and Bormann were the witnesses. Then Hitler dictated his last will and testament. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Eva Braun took poison, and Hitler took out his pistol, put it to his temple, and pulled the trigger. Their bodies were rapidly removed from the bunker and burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden under heavy Soviet shell fire. The reason for the destruction of the corpses is that the remaining Nazis didn't want them to fall into Soviet hands where they could be made a show of and paraded through the streets and all that kind of thing. Joseph and Magda Goebbels murdered their 6 children and then killed themselves shortly thereafter. Several other senior bunker officials committed suicide as Soviet forces closed in. Germany did eventually sign unconditional surrender on May 7th, 1945. So ended the life of Hitler. What are we to make of all of this? As a leader, Hitler has a checkered record, let us say, setting aside the fact that he committed great atrocities, that he did things that were bad. If we're just to evaluate him as a leader, was he good at accomplishing his goals? At the beginning of his reign and at the beginning of the war, he did remarkable things that no one could have ever expected. His audacity, his willingness to do the surprising thing, enabled him to achieve victories that were spectacular, frankly. But the boldness that worked in 1936 became the recklessness of 1939. It's all the same stuff. The no-retreat instinct that saved his army in 1941 condemned the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. So I don't think you can separate it. The leadership style that built the Reich gave us a Holocaust without a written order, gave us competing fiefdoms that paralyzed the war effort, gave us a regime where nobody could tell the truth and nobody could plan strategically. The belief that motivated Hitler, that very sincere belief, is what allowed people to buy in. Here's a man who's sincere. Here's a man who really believes what he's saying. But that same belief is what doomed him at the same time, because he really believed that there was a Jewish conspiracy. He really believed that the Russians were just an inferior race who just couldn't stand up to the superiority of the German man when it came to facing them head on in a military conflict. He believed Germany's racial destiny would prevail through sheer willpower. So when you look at Hitler, the seeds of his defeat were there from the very beginning. And it does cause you to reflect, because the same thing is true for all of us. Of course, hopefully we don't do as many bad things as Hitler did. But I think it's important to recognize that you can't just carve off your weaknesses, because they are the flip side of your strengths. He could have walked away from the table. I asked you at the beginning, if you had everything you wanted, except for the one thing, could you walk away from the table? Could you collect your winnings? Could you go home? And Hitler couldn't, and he didn't. But that's because it's the same attitude that wouldn't allow him to do that is the attitude that allowed him to get everything else, to conduct these amazing invasions, these surprise attacks that took over Europe. So no, you can't carve out your weaknesses. Hopefully you don't have weaknesses that are as glaring and as destructive as those of Hitler. But this is probably the most odd episode of How to Take Over the World I've ever done. And I guess that's the thing that I am left reflecting on, is you need to recognize that you have weaknesses that can be addressed and can be helped, and you have those that can't. And you need to put yourself in a position as much as possible where maybe you have other people who can support you. You can't just be a dictator all the time in life. You need to let other people take over in certain situations, because the same attributes of your personality that allow you to have great victories in certain aspects of your life are going to lead to great defeats if you're put in the wrong positions and situations. So thus ends our long series on the life of Adolf Hitler. I know this has been very different. We've done some villains before, but no one quite like Hitler. So I hope you enjoyed it, or if not enjoyed it, I hope you learned something from it. And until next episode, thank you for listening to How to Take Over the World. This episode is brought to you by Speechify. I used Speechify a ton for the research for this episode. Speechify turns anything into a podcast. So I will take the books that I am reading, I'll put them into Speechify, and then I will read as I'm listening, which gives me higher retention of the books that I'm reading. Also, when I have Speechify open, I can just make highlights and take notes right there in Speechify, which then I can take over to my notes that I use for these episodes. So Speechify has been incredibly useful for me. I think you'll love it. I think everyone would love it. I think Speechify is just a really great piece of software. And if you're a real sicko for How to Take Over the World, you can even listen to anything in my voice on Speechify. I am one of the official voices of Speechify. So using AI, you can have me read whatever you would like to. So check it out. You can go to speechify.com/Ben to get 15% off Speechify Premium. That is, again, speechify.com/Ben.